Welcome back to Houston Car and Truck Accident Law with Hank Stout. I'm Abby Arnold, sitting down with Hank Stout of Sutliff and Stout in Houston, Texas.
Hey, Abby, happy to be here.
Today is episode 7, and we are answering the one question every injured rider in Houston asks after a Uber or Lyft crash, which is, what is my case actually worth and what makes that number move? So we are walking through the damages that make up the settlement, the layered rideshare insurance periods that set the ceiling, the liability fight over who actually pays, the Texas fault and deadline rules that can quietly shrink the number, and the evidence and process that decide what a rider really takes home. So getting into question 1, a rider is fresh off the crash and just wants a headline number. So when someone asks what their Uber accident settlement is worth in Houston, what is the honest answer?
The honest answer, Abby, is it depends. It depends on what your injuries are. It depends on what your damages are. It depends on, a lot of different factors, especially in the rideshare. It's very particular about, what insurance applies when. And so you have to kind of really analyze the situation to determine what is available to the person who was injured.
So a rider wants to know what lever raises or lowers the value. What are the main things that actually move the number on rideshare settlements?
Sure. So the most important thing is who is at fault, A. B, what are the injuries and what is the extent of those injuries? How much medical care is it going to take and how is it going to affect your life? That's the damages question. And then C, you can have Uber drivers that, if they're not in the app or on a ride, then different policy amounts will apply. And so take Uber, for instance. If the person is in the app and they're available for a ride and then they hit someone, well, then there's only, $50,000 or $50,000 per person, $100,000 per accident coverage. Whereas if they actually had a rider and they were on a trip, the coverage amount goes to $1 million. So there's a lot of different factors that are going to be at play with what insurance is available, how much insurance is available. And so you really need to analyze all those things to determine, what your injuries are and then what coverage there is to cover those damages.
And let's say a rider is staring at the first stack of bills and lost paychecks. What kind of damages actually make up an Uber accident settlement in Houston?
So an Uber accident, whether it's Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, or any of the other ride service companies, the damages available to people in the state of Texas are the same, regardless of the type of accident, right? It really just affects coverage. And so in Texas, what the elements of damages are, what your economic damages, which is past lost wages, future lost wages or loss of wage earning capacity, past medical expenses, and then future medical expenses that a person reasonably can expect as a result of their injuries. And so those are what are known as the economic damages. And then you have non-economic damages, which are past pain and suffering, future pain and suffering, past mental anguish, future mental anguish, disfigurement, loss of consortium. There's a bunch of different elements of non-economic damages, but then that's what makes up your damages. And then once you know what your damages are, then you look at, well, what's the ability to pay? And that's what makes Uber accidents or Lyft accidents or these rideshare accidents a little bit unique. Because there's generally more coverage, but the more coverage only applies when they are actually inside the app and working inside the app. So whether they have a rider in their car or they're actually out on a delivery, if it's a food delivery service.
And a rider with a brutal injury might be told that the bills are only half the story. So how does pain and suffering get valued? And are there caps on it in Texas rideshare cases?
So no, there are no caps on rideshare non-economic damages. So no caps apply in a rideshare case as it relates to non-economic damages. And non-economic damages are hard to determine just because there's not a bill that goes along with it. There's not some set number, right? Well, as a lawyer, I'll look at other cases, the extent of those injuries, how it impacts the person's life, the amount of pain that they're in, the type of treatment that they're going to have, the duration of that treatment. And then that helps you kind of figure out, okay, well, these non-economic damages are more substantial than, say, I just got in a small fender bender, had to have, one doctor's visit, now I'm feeling better. Well, that's not worth a whole lot of money. Whereas if it changes your life and your ability to do things you enjoy and spend time with your family, well, then that's obviously worth a lot more money because it's impacting your life a great deal.
So the value is damages plus available coverage discounted by fault. The single biggest coverage variable in a rideshare case is which insurance period was running at the moment of the crash, and that is where we go next. So a rider assumes Uber's coverage is one flat policy the whole ride, but most riders have no idea Uber's insurance changes 3 times during one trip. Why does that matter for what a case is worth?
Sure. So if you're a rider that's actually in the Uber, then generally you've already signed up for the Uber and the Uber has picked you up. And if there's an accident where the Uber driver's at fault, then you have the ability to sue that Uber driver for up to $1 million. So does the person who they hit. So let's say there was an accident and it was the Uber driver's fault, and they had a passenger. The passenger can sue the Uber driver, and then the person they hit can sue the Uber driver. And there's typically a combined single limit policy of $1 million. That's because there was a person inside the app, they were on a ride. Same thing applies in Lyft situations. Now, let's say that you're the person who was hit by an Uber driver, right? So an Uber driver hits you. Well, then the question becomes, well, were they in the app and available for rides? And if they were, but they didn't have a passenger, then typically Uber and Lyft will provide $50,000 per person, $100,000 per accident. If there was a person in there, so they were on a ride, then the $1 million would apply. And then let's just say it's an Uber driver that is logged out of the app. They're no longer interested in accepting a ride. Well, then the Uber policy wouldn't apply at all, and it would just be the person's personal insurance, whatever that amount may be. And in the state of Texas, a minimum insurance policy is $30,000 per person, $60,000 per accident.
Okay, so let's say a rider was hit by an Uber driver who had clocked out of the app. If the app was off when the crash happened, does that wipe out the settlement?
So if an Uber driver hits a person that's not in his vehicle and he's not in the app, then the Uber driver's personal insurance would apply. And so whatever limits that individual has at the time would be the amount of coverage. Now, in the app, the rideshare companies state that their drivers are required to carry at least minimum policies, but a lot of them don't. So sometimes there's no insurance. So it just depends. But if the Uber driver has an Uber customer in the car, then there's always going to be that $1 million policy.
And a passenger wants to know if the headline $1 million coverage applies to their ride. When does Uber's $1 million policy actually kick in? And what does that ceiling mean for a Houston passenger?
So as soon as the Uber driver accepts the ride and is in, and so they're going to get the person to pick them up or the person's in their car, the $1 million coverage will apply. And it continues to apply until the passenger leaves, cancels the ride, or the ride is ended. So that is the extent of when that $1 million in coverage applies. If an Uber driver gets in an accident outside that period, then it depends, were they in the app available for a ride? And if they're available for a ride, then Uber provides coverage for $50,000 per person, $100,000 per accident. Lyft does the same.
Okay, so a crash happened while the driver was logged in, but not yet accepted a ride. Texas drivers carry low minimum limits. How does that shrink a period one rideshare settlement?
So in that scenario where the Uber driver or the Lyft driver is in the app available for a ride, but doesn't actually have a ride, then there's a $50,000 per person, $100,000 per accident, which is larger than the 30-60 minimum policy in the state of Texas. So that would be the policy that applies, the 50 to 100. And so in that scenario, there's a little bit more. In a scenario where they're not logged into the app yet and available for rides, well, then it's whatever the person's personal policy is. So if the person had a policy that was 30-60, then that's the coverage that would apply. If they had a bigger policy, then that's the coverage would apply. If they had no insurance, then there would be no insurance, and Uber wouldn't have any responsibility for that.
Once we know which period was running, the next fight is over who is actually on the hook, the driver, the platform, or another party. That liability question is what we're going to get into next. So a rider is not sure whether to blame the driver or the company. When a Houstonian is hurt in an Uber, who is actually on the hook for the settlement? The driver, Uber, or someone else?
Great question, Abby. And so typically when an Uber driver gets in an accident, it's the Uber driver that is at fault, or the one person you would sue and who is responsible. The only thing that Uber does or Lyft does is they provide insurance for that driver while they're in their app using their service. And so the person in the state of Texas who you would sue is the actual driver who caused the collision or the injuries.
And then if a rider heard Uber drivers are not employees and worries the claim is weaker, Uber calls its drivers independent contractors. So how does that label affect what an injured rider can recover?
Well, as an independent contractor, which is what they are, the only policy that you have against, or claim that you have against Uber, is against the driver. And again, Uber provides the insurance coverage for that driver, but that's the extent of their liability. You can't actually go further and hold Uber responsible for more damages, because they would say that he was an independent contractor and that they didn't control the manner and method of his operations, and therefore they are not responsible because he's not he's not an agent of theirs technically. And so that means that they're not responsible under respondent superior for his actions. And so that's all a lot of legalese, but really what it means is that in the state of Texas, you can sue the driver. And if he's in the app, then the Uber or Lyft insurance will apply, but that's the extent of what you can recover.
Someone might be wondering whether the company itself did something wrong. Can Uber be sued for negligent hiring in Texas? And does that add to a settlement?
So you can't, the claim for negligent hiring won't apply because the person's not an employee. They're an independent contractor. And as an independent contractor, you can't hold them they can't hold Uber responsible for the actions of an independent contractor. Again, the only benefit that you get out of having an Uber case is you get the stepped up amount of insurance, which is typically if they're in the app and under a ride, it's $1 million, which is a lot more than the 30-60 minimum required by the state of Texas.
Let's say a passenger was injured when another car ran the red light and hit their Uber. So what if someone in Houston gets hurt as a passenger, but the Uber driver wasn't the one at fault?
In that scenario, Uber does not carry what's called underinsured motorist coverage. They've specifically rejected it, as has Lyft. So both Lyft and Uber in the state of Texas at this point do not provide underinsured motorist coverage. And so there would be no claim against the driver or Uber under their policy. And so you would have to look to your own personal insurance policy to see if you had what's called underinsured or uninsured motorist coverage. And if so, then that coverage would kick in, but you wouldn't have the coverage through Uber or Lyft.
Liability and coverage set the table, but Texas has its own legal overlays, the fault rule, the filing deadline, and the injury picture that can quietly raise or shrink the final number. So that is next. Let's say a rider is being told the crash was partly their fault. Texas has a fault rule that can quietly cut a settlement. So how does the 51% bar work?
So if you're involved in an accident with an Uber driver, if you're a passenger in the vehicle, clearly you can't be responsible. So, I mean, somebody else would be responsible. But let's say you're driving a car, you get involved in an accident with another Uber driver, and they want to blame you. We are a comparative fault state. And as long as you're less than 51% responsible for the collision, then you're able to recover whatever percentage of your damages that you weren't responsible. So if you were 30% responsible and the Uber driver was 70% responsible, then you get 70% of your damages from the at-fault driver, and then your damages get reduced by that 30%. So out of the 100%, you only get 70. And so that's the way the math works.
And how long does someone in Houston have to file an Uber accident claim before the settlement window closes?
The statute of limitations for all negligence claims in the state of Texas is 2 years from the date of the incident. So after the expiration of 2 years, then your claims are time barred under the statute of limitations.
And let's say that a passenger went down really hard and woke up with a head injury. A bad injury can change everything. So, how do head and spine injuries reshape a rideshare settlement?
Mild traumatic brain injuries, moderate traumatic brain injuries, severe traumatic brain injuries are life altering. And each are different. And the way they manifest themselves are differently. And so as a lawyer, you really have to understand what signs to look for to make sure that your client is getting the treatment that they need to address the issue and get diagnosed, because these are lifelong problems. I mean, in a mild TBI, the type of problems that you're going to see are forgetfulness, short-term memory problems, inability to organize yourself, headaches, sometimes blurred vision. I mean, you'll have all these different things, and typically the injured person won't be recognizing it. So you need to talk to their loved ones to say, hey, you really need to watch out for these telltale signs, so that then you can get them into a neurologist, a neuropsychologist. You can start doing some cognitive therapy. All of this type of treatment costs a lot of money. And so obviously that's going to increase the amount of your damages and the medical expenses. And so it's great when you have a defendant who also has the ability to pay, because oftentimes people don't, right? I mean, the $30,000 sounds like a lot of money, but it can really be eaten up quick in medical bills. And so that additional coverage that's provided by Uber or Lyft to provide the $1 million in coverage is extremely helpful in cases where the damages are significant.
And a family lost a loved one in a rideshare crash and might be trying to understand their rights. When a rideshare crash takes a life, what does a Houston wrongful death settlement look like?
And in the case of a wrongful death involving an Uber, you're going to want to look at all of the facts and try to figure out if the Uber driver's at fault and they were in the app and they had a passenger or accepted a ride, then the $1 million coverage would apply. If they were just available in the app, but they hadn't accepted a ride, then you would just get the $50,000 in coverage. And the reason that is so people say, typically when you hear policies, you say 5,100. Well, it's per person. And so wrongful death claims are what's known as derivative claims. And so if you think of a wheel and a spoke, I mean, the middle is the hub, right? And that's the person who's passed away. And they may have parents who have claims. They may have a wife or a husband that have a claim. They may have children that have claims. All those claims flow through that one individual person. And so they're called derivative claims. And in that scenario, they would only have access to the per person limit if it were the smaller one. Whereas like when you hear the $1 million limit, that is what's called a combined single limit. So that applies to all of the people who were injured, regardless of whether the claims are derivative or not. So it's a little complicated in understanding the insurance, but it's very important because it'll dictate how much a family will get in that type of scenario.
Yeah, complicated process, but you explained it very clearly. Thank you. Damages, coverage, fault, and deadlines all rest on one thing: the evidence that proves which period was running and who was at fault. The last segment is about locking that evidence down and walking the case to a check. So, a rider might not realize the proof of which policy applies lives inside Uber's servers. So Uber doesn't keep crash evidence forever. How does the trip data drive settlement value?
Well, a lot of Uber drivers will have drive cams, both inside and out of the vehicle, both for their protection and the rider's protection. So that evidence is extremely helpful. And so that evidence can show whether or not you were on an Uber trip or not. Also, as the in-app evidence talks about, like you're wanting to show that, well, the person actually had a rider in their vehicle at the time and were in the window that provides the stepped-up coverage. And so that's what you're really looking for, right? When you start looking at in the app, there's Uber will go in and see and date stamp when the accident occurred. And then they'll compare it to their records to see, well, was the person in the app, and where had they accepted a ride, because they have to do a coverage analysis to determine what policy applies. Is it the policy that's the 5100 policy? Is it the policy that provides no coverage? Or is it the policy that provides a single limit of $1 million? And so that's what they'll do. And that's why that information is important.
If someone was in a wreck and climbs out of the Uber and only has a few minutes to act, what evidence should a Houston rider gather right after the crash to protect the value of their claim?
Sure. So my suggestion would be to take a screenshot of the ride. So then you have the information for the driver. You get any contact information for the driver that was driving the Uber or the Lyft. You also get the information of whoever was involved in the collision with the driver. So you have all of that. Try to document the scene, take a few pictures from various angles, and then you can go from there. I mean, we have a lot of cases where, let's say an Uber driver gets in an accident, so the passenger leaves because he doesn't want to wait around for 4 hours. Well, you still need to get all of the information from the Uber driver so you can get the case number for the police report and other information, because sometimes, like, if you only have the first name of the driver, it's hard to look up a police report without the last name. So you want to get the first and last name. You get pictures of driver's license. I mean, whatever identifying information you can get would be super helpful.
And an adjuster might claim that the ride had already ended when the crash happened. Insurers sometimes argue the trip ends seconds before the crash. How does that period shift tactic attack a settlement?
Well, it can. I mean, if the settlement is canceled or the rider, it's marked completed, so you're stepping out of the car and it's completed, and then an accident happens, a different type of coverage would apply. But if they're just trying to say, well, you were dropped off, but you hadn't been, well, that's really easy to show, because you can take a picture of where you are, you're still in the car, you're still doing these things, and you know what your destination was. And so you can show that you weren't at that destination yet. And therefore you can demonstrate to the insurance company that in fact you get the stepped up limit, not the lower limit.
So, from the day someone calls a Houston rideshare lawyer, what does the road to a settlement check actually look like?
Well, so you're going to hire a lawyer. A lawyer is going to do an analysis about what coverage would apply. They're going to gather up your records. At our law office, we'll try to make sure that if you need to see a doctor or a specialist that you can't find, we'll try to help you find one, because we want to make sure that we know what's wrong with you before we go try to talk to anybody about settling your case. And so, then we'll gather up the evidence necessary to establish fault: the police report, pictures, witness statements, surveillance footage, dash cam video, anything. We might send an expert out there to download the vehicle to get speeds of the vehicles, to do a crush damage analysis. There's a lot of evidence you can gather on liability. In the meantime, you'll be treating with your medical providers to figure out exactly what's wrong with you. And then once we figure out what's wrong with you and how it's going to affect your life and your activities of daily living, is it going to make it where you can't do your job? Are you having difficulty doing your job? Things of that nature. Then we can help figure out your damage model. And then from there, then we can put together a settlement package or a demand to see if the insurance company wants to try to do the right thing and resolve the case. And if they don't, well, that's okay, because we've already got all this other evidence gathered, and we're happy to take the case to trial, because at the end of the day, the jury gets to decide what you're entitled to receive if the insurance company refuses to be reasonable.
So, before we close, if someone in Houston needs to remember one thing about protecting the value of their Uber accident case, what should it be?
Well, to protect the value of any claim, the thing you must do is document what happened. Make sure you get all the information, the people involved in the collision, and then make sure that you get the treatment that you need. A lot of people won't treat immediately because it's expensive, or they're worried about doctor's bills. But the thing is, if you don't document your injuries, then the insurance companies are going to say that you're not injured or that you're not hurt, and it's going to make it harder for you to recover for the injuries that you sustained as a result of the collision. So I would encourage everyone, if you get involved in an accident and you're hurt, you need to go see a doctor to make sure you're okay.
That is great advice for everyone out there. If you are a rider in Houston or anywhere across Texas and you have been hurt in an Uber or Lyft crash, call Sutliff and Stout at 713-987-7111 or visit HoustonCarAccidents.lawyer to talk to Hank Stout directly. The consultation is free. Thank you so much for listening to Houston Car and Truck Accident Law with Hank Stout. We will see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Abby. Have a great day.